Vous avez une analyse et une conclusion très claire. Merci beaucoup. We now have 30 minutes. It won't be like yesterday. We have enough time. We can therefore go straight to questions from the floor or remarks. Could you be as succinct as possible? We will take 3 questions at a time in order to ensure that we are as concise as possible and to ensure that we can answer as many questions as possible. Could you tell us who you are first? Jean-Paul Lepnon. A question, the energy transition and its definition. Each of our speakers here today has, at one point or another, spoken of the issue of global warming. We know that coal, we still have enough for another 100 years. So is the definition of an energy transition the disappearance of fossil fuels or the need to reduce the carbon impact with regards to emissions produced in Bangladesh and other countries? That's the first question. The second question was for Michel Petit with regards to forecasts, population forecasts. Now, I speak with people in Africa. For them, population is never a problem. Have we taken into account in forecast the different cultures and how children are seen in these different cultures? Thank you very much for that question. A third question. My name is Christian Couturier. I work for an organization called Solagro, which produced 2 scenarios on ecological transition. One scenario called after 2050 and the other scenario called a megawatt. And both of these scenarios, the common thread I worked on was bioenergies based on agriculture and forest. We are activists in order to ensure that bioenergy is used for the energy transition, but also for food and agriculture. These are vast issues, and we do have to change the current paradigm. What we've been trying to do is find a solution, and this is an observation that I share with everything that's been said by people on the panel, including those who disagree with each other. I believe that everybody has their own view of matters, but we do need to find solutions in order to address all of these issues. So, for example, I'm not going to go into the detail of the work that we ourselves have carried out, but what I would like to say is to underscore the fact that given the debate that we've had today, we're still in the same paradigm, i.e. we're still using models of production for industrial ends. Now, we spoke of the food, feed, fodder, and fuel. So energy, fibers, feed, and food. I would add another F, forests, and organic matter, the manure, for example, which is, and for fertilization. Our strategy is to ensure that aside from competition between users, we need to have a synergy between the energies. For example, methanization, not corn methanization like in Germany, but of vegetation using well-established processes. Now, that's not what we're necessarily promoting. Unfortunately, we still remain trapped by bioethanol, corn in Germany for methanization. What I'm saying is that there are other ways to make energy which can offer a solution to all of these problems. And I think it would be useful to look at these other solutions and think laterally instead of being trapped in the current paradigm, which is industrialized biofuels using biomass. Thank you very much for those questions. And all I can do is suggest to all people in the room to read what you've just been talking about. Who would like to answer the first two questions? The first question on the definition of the energy transition. You should be answering on the question of energy transition. Well, I'm here as moderator officially, but you're the only person who's written about the definition of the energy transition. Well, it's a rather tricky question to answer, given that there is no standard definition for the energy shift, for the energy transition. In my introduction, I did try to offer some form of a definition or a kind of definition that I would call an ordinary but easily understandable transition, which is the period of time between a past situation and a current situation, which is causing problems and that needs to be brought to an end, and a future situation which isn't yet stable because there are gaps in technology and that is not defined in a specific period of time. So, for example, 2-3 decades' time, with perhaps a tendency to lean towards solar energy and energy storage. But the energy mix question, well, the energy mix has not yet been set in stone and will vary depending on the country. It will be different for sub-Saharan Africa, for Middle East, India, China, etc. And between these two situations, there is a transitional period. And this is what we're talking about over the next 2.5 days. We're trying to characterize this transition period. Perhaps through work undertaken by scientists or think tank studies, we will arrive at certain factors. For example, the longer the transition period, i.e. solutions for the future, if they're not immediate, the longer this transition period, the more there is a chance of an increase in fuel prices because there will be a fall in oil supply, and therefore the longer this transition period, the more difficult it will be for us to reduce GHG emissions because we'll still be relying on oil as a fuel. And therefore, perhaps one way of answering your question is the purpose of discussing this energy transition is to optimize the reduction in carbon emissions and go as quickly as possible, on the one hand, to move away from an oil-based economy, and secondly, because it's the will of the majority of industrialized countries to move away from nuclear energy. And it therefore offers us a window of opportunity and constraint. Within those conditions, we have to define the type of transition that we want. I want to insist on one point, however. It's difficult to talk about transition in one room because everybody has their own view of what that transition should be. And some people will put the accent on a specific solution. For example, moving away from nuclear energy. Other people will prefer focusing on the greenhouse effect. Others will want to focus on technical solutions. Others will want to put more of an emphasis on social justice and ethical matters. What we want to achieve is to ensure that there is no clash between these points of view, but to ensure that everybody has their opportunity to voice their opinion in order to move towards an efficient compromise to ensure that we can achieve some form of a way forward for this transition. I'm not quite sure I understood the question. Perhaps what I can do is take up from what Michel Griffon just said to answer what I've understood. From what I understand, the remark has something to do with the methodology that is employed. Today, we are confronted with many controversies and a very complex situation. So if we want to push this analysis further, then we may have to simplify some aspects. Now, for example, one of the simplifications that I made, first and foremost, I'm not particularly bothered about defining the energy transition as such. What I'm saying is that there is increasing pressure on biomass and on land use and use of land for cultures. That problem in itself, as I said, but as my colleagues have said as well, raises many problems which are completely relevant for trying to situate social justice. So my method uses simplification in order to discuss the underlying key issues. Now, more specifically on population forecasts, I think I've understood what you're saying. What you're saying is that the notion of population is viewed very differently depending on the country and the culture in that country. Now, what I wanted to emphasize in my presentation was perhaps a simplified view of things by saying that everybody more or less agrees that population pressure is going to influence on overall demand. If we've got 5 billion people in 2027, demand won't be the same, or the demand pressure won't be the same as with another population. And that's what I wanted to emphasize, even if there are differences in population forecasts. So answering the last question, I think it is indeed a point of interest to look at possible synergies and harness those. Now, my expert view, and I may be wrong, is that the potential for harnessing these synergies are on a different scale to the issues about which we've been talking. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't work on these synergies or not harness their potential, but for the moment, it doesn't hang well together with these simplified analyses. And I don't know whether I agree whether they would lead to a change in the paradigm. We have gone very quickly over all of these issues. Now we can look at the problem from different levels, at the holding level, at the local level. Now, multinationals are looking for investment opportunities, and there is a need to generate new markets because of the slump in markets. For this reason, one of the alternatives was that the COP21 and future events, there are going to be many alternative scenarios going to present what can be done and help us understand what can be done on different levels. I hope there will be other questions on alternatives that you mentioned. Perhaps we could give a few examples so that everybody can understand the possible synergies. For example, methane production at a holding level from non-food biomass or biomass from non-food products and residues that aren't farmed back into the land. The methane produced from that can be either sold or it can be reused in the local economy. And then there's a residue which then can be farmed back into the land to increase land fertility. So there is a certain amount of synergy there. Now, we could also say that agriculture is for feeding mankind, but detrimental to forests. So what we could do is give the priority to agriculture that is favorable to biological diversity, not necessarily in forests, but overall biodiversity. So there are a number of examples, and I think there are an increasing number of those cases where synergies can be found because there is a way to resolve the conflict between a finite planet and the growing range of needs. And I think that's going to require a lot of intelligence and identifying these synergies. Now, are there any other remarks or comments on this point, which is a very interesting subject? Hello, my name is Frédéric Rottier. I work for the Equivalent Institute in Belgium, and by the by, I'm also a farmer. My question is very simple. It's to do with the terms that are used. I'm very surprised to hear that you're talking about biofuels, whereas in fact, I think we should be talking about agri-fuels, because there is nothing organic about the methods that are used. And they are used in areas where the reforms to produce biofuels have had a negative impact on overall ecology and sustainability. Well, I agree with your point, but it is a very far-reaching point. We use the term biofuels because that's the given, or that's the name that's been attributed to that term. I use biofuels. I think what's important is perhaps not get lost in terms, whereas at the same time we need to be clear in the terms that we used, because in French, bio is the same as organic. My name is Fabien Balaguesh. I'm in the French Association Agroforestry. Thank you very much for this very informative debate. I would like to come back to one of the conclusions that were drawn, which was quite ambitious and I remain rather skeptic about, is that yield will inexorably increase because it's a given rule, and it's what we need to extract ourselves from the current crisis. What I see is that land use or land is being overused, and fertility is central to this theory or this hypothesis. So I find it very difficult to say off the cuff that yields will increase. I think what's more important is to review our production models. If land is being overused, we need to think about problems such as erosion, overpollution of soils with chemicals, because yield depends on land, and we know that land use today has reduced land fertility. So shouldn't we be putting the focus more on changing our land use, which includes forests, and focus more on conservation agriculture, bearing in mind that the systems that I'm talking about have multiple factors. And then talking about biomass production, my point is, I think we need to bear in mind all the different contributing factors to agriculture. Now, with regards to biodiversity, that has just been mentioned, in my view, forests aren't the most diverse ecosystems in biological terms. For me, it is the forest edges, i.e. the borders between farmland and the forest. That's where the greatest level concentration of diversity exists, and this is what we're trying to preserve and increase in agricultural ecosystems, whilst at the same time obviously trying to increase the resistance of these ecosystems and productivity in order to work towards sustainable agriculture. Thank you very much. Agroforestry is indeed very closely tied to what we're talking about in synergies. Just a brief remark, because the comment was directed at what I said, and it'll also give me an opportunity to comment on what Geneviève Savigny brought up, which disagreed with what I put forward. Now, the discussion obviously is a lot more complex that I expressed in very simplified terms, but it was a little bit of a provocation. It was on purpose. Our society, and in particular French society, are particularly marked by excessive productivism. And my fear is that we forget about the issue of productivity as we work. And I find this is somewhat of a provocation. Economists have spent a lot of time asking themselves about this whole notion of productivity. Yield is the average land productivity. It's the total production divided by the area. And what I wanted to say in my presentation was that there was a certain increase in demand, and this is going to tie into energy issues, and therefore it was undesirable to increase the surfaces that are cultivated, and therefore something in the equation is going to have to be moved, and the only way to do that is to move productivity. But how do we achieve that? And what are the issues and stakes at play? Well, the costs I qualified as well, there are many of these costs that are externalities, which also have to be factored into the equation. And this leads to another concept, which is global productivity. It's not just productivity, average productivity of land itself. It's everything else. And interaction between the two is far from being simple. And yet, the first point, i.e. the simple conclusion, is that average productivity on a global scale needs to increase. And I think that that is clear. And agroforestry is one of the ways in which average productivity can increase, because the average yield, if that increases, it will make it possible to increase average productivity overall. And therefore the question, the difficult question to answer is how to obtain this increase in productivity, whereas we know that external costs are significant. And therefore the challenge we're faced with, and indeed it is to that Michel Griffon is trying to offer an answer with agroecology and ecologically intensive farming. This is where forestry can come into play and offer a solution, and in my view, falls into a broad area of research which should aim to achieve the increase in productivity which is socially acceptable and offers greater social justice. However, I shall, despite all of these subtleties and nuances, continue to beat my drum and say that it would be difficult to increase productivity that we need without increasing the yield per hectare.
Yeah. Sorry. I mean, I would certainly agree with what the last speaker said, well, the last person asking a question about agroforestry said, and what Genevieve said earlier, that we really need to move towards models of agroecology and genuinely diverse agroforestry and away from industrial agriculture and also industrial forestry, which hasn't been wasn't a topic of this session. As you can guess, I would agree with a more pessimistic view about the idea that yields will keep rising. Certainly, with industrial agriculture, coupled with soil depletion, soil pollution, freshwater depletion, and with all the IPCC's forecasts about ever more extreme weather impacts. That would seem to be a very optimistic forecast indeed. But what I want to just briefly touch on is a question of, can we have a different paradigm? Can we, with a different approach to looking after land, to agriculture and to caring for forests, can we then have with using synergies, have a way of having large-scale bioenergy that's really, really positive? And I would just put a little bit of a caution on that. I mean, certainly, as within Biofuel Watch, none of us think that there is no place for bioenergy. I think we would certainly think that on a local, small-scale level, communities many communities have found ways of using energies from forests, from agriculture in really sustainable ways, but they are small scale. If you're looking at bioenergy making a contribution towards, say, powering capital cities like London or Paris, or driving people's individual car use, that is where I really don't think it's just a matter of a paradigm. There was a really good article, presentation by a different author some years ago called Mining Biomass Forever Without Consequence. And I think we just need to remember that we can't do that. We can't keep taking vast quantities of biomass out of the biosphere in any form and expect not to suffer the consequences in terms of depleting the nutrients, depleting the water, and competing with land for food and destroying biodiversity and with the emissions. That is just not going to happen. And our view, it really, if you look for large-scale energy solutions, really cannot look at bioenergy, certainly not on an industrial scale.
Thank you for calling how to manage this complexity. Things are not that simple. Il nous reste quelques minutes, 4 minutes, une question.
We still have a few minutes for a last question. Bertrand Cumet, I work for a French organization. Now, I haven't exactly been satisfied by all the debates. As a normal, ordinary consumer, somewhat preoccupied with social injustice, I ask myself, what can I do on a daily basis in order to contribute to more justice in terms of food? I don't know who has an answer to this question. In the competition between energy and food and the 5 Fs, couldn't feed be used? Or is there a way of reducing our meat consumption which would then reduce the pressure for feed? Perhaps that is a way to rebalance the equation. Who has an answer to this? Reducing meat consumption in industrial countries, I think, is necessary now, without being against all cattle breeding or husbandry. because animals are one of the best processes for converting grass into other biomass. But it's more about buying more locally, encouraging local production, and strengthening these local ties. I think that action is necessary on a small scale. And as well, trying to get a better understanding of what's going on. For example, attending a symposium like this. For example, with the presentations that we had yesterday, the solutions weren't that obvious, but simply being aware, knowing what policies there are, having a point of view as a citizen is a first step. And talking about the COP21, this will again be an opportunity to demonstrate. It's going to be necessary to lobby governments in order to ensure that they move towards policies which include thought about people and society, and not just lean on large anonymous mechanisms such as carbon trading schemes, etc. And any implication by any citizen, I think, is always going to be positive.
We need to distinguish between different types of meats. Chicken and pork is produced from maize and soybeans and so on. These are plants that we can, as humans, can consume directly. So if we want to reduce land use for animal feed, we need to eat less of those types of meat. But what's incontestable is the polygastric animals such as cows, cattle. They have been designed to eat fodder, and it's the only way of using fodder. If you give them maize and soybeans, and which can be used by humans, we're leading them to compete directly with humans for food, and that can amount in some cases to waste. So to eat cattle meat that have been fed by grass is responsible, but eating cattle that's been fed by human food is not. So if we want to spare the land use, if we want to reduce land use, we've got to be careful what we're eating. There's also the issue of food biology to take into account. We eat 60 to 80 kilos of meat per year, and we can survive on 20 kilos of excellent meat every year, which will reduce the risks of heart disease, and which will have an impact on land use at European and perhaps even planetary level. Michel and Almut, si vous voulez rajouter quelque chose, nous n'avons pas beaucoup de temps encore. Microphone, please. To reformulate what you said, citizens and consumers, what they can do is essential in contributing towards greater social justice, and I do agree that to understand how the world works it's very complicated to start with. To improve one's understanding, to take on to influences from public opinion, pressurize governments, and have individual commitment that's all essential as well. Almut, have you?
Okay. Yes, well, I would say basically support, yes. I mean, being in France, I wouldn't want to suggest any specific organizations people can join, but generally, join campaigns for and speak out for measures that really reduce our energy use, make us a more low energy society. Move, if you're looking at biofuels, move away in the issues with vis-a-vis oil, really look at supporting policies that reduce dependence on car use, that reduce individual, the need to travel privately, and support campaigns against industrial agriculture, for agroecology, and and in terms of forestry, support ones against, that protect biodiversity and forests against conversion to plantations and large-scale industrial logging, basically.
Thank you. Bien.
That brings our session to a close. Our session was focused especially on understanding what happens in the world. Listening to the contribution of our colleague from Solagro, I realized we weren't really on the solution side of things, but I do point you towards Solagro's website, which has a great deal of information. It's